I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, we wanted to return to a couple of conversations that I had recently on the subject of film. To start us off, this past September, we talked with Kai Bird, the author who inspired this year's blockbuster film, Oppenheimer. Kai is the head of the CUNY Grad Center's Leon Levy Biography Center. He offered his thoughts on what he thinks people should take away from that film, as well as from his book. Thank you for joining us, Kai. And this book was written 18 years ago. Janet Maslin in the New York Times called it a work of voluminous scholarship and lucid insight. You watched the movie this summer for the first time, 3-hour movie. How faithful is it to the book?
Oh, it's an incredible movie. It's, a cinematic performance, a great artistic achievement, but it's very faithful to the book. And that's a miracle in Hollywood for most biographers.
It is indeed. What was your role in the film? I mean, obviously you watched it, you oversaw it to some extent. Did you ever say, whoa, wait a minute, that didn't happen that way, or this would be a better way of doing it? How did that work?
I have to say I had very little involvement in the actual making of the film. I was invited to be on set at one point, and before they started filming, Christopher Nolan met with me here in New York and escorted me into a hotel room in Greenwich Village, handed me the screenplay, and said, take as long as you need to read it. Well, it was 180 pages, and it took me 3.5 hours to read this script. And I was blown away. It's an amazing achievement. He manages to synthesize the highlights of this very long 700-plus page biography of a very complicated figure, Robert Oppenheimer. And he transforms it into a cinematic experience that's also faithful to the history. It's just, I read the script and I think I had 2 small little suggestions. Otherwise, I just told him it was brilliant.
Pretty impressive. When people finish reading the book, and if you haven't read it, you should, and if you haven't seen the film, you should. But when people read the book, see the film, what do you want them to walk away with?
I want them to question what happened in history. I want them to argue about the history, argue about the end of World War II, how it happened, whether the atomic bomb was necessary or not, the nature of this special weapon. And I want them to also come away, half the movie is devoted to what happens to Oppenheimer after World War II, after he's celebrated as America's most famous scientist, the father of the atomic bomb. 9 years later, he is brought down in this humiliating kangaroo court of a security hearing and publicly humiliated. And he becomes sort of the chief victim of the celebrity victim of the McCarthy era. And I want people to revisit McCarthyism because it explains a lot of our current divisive politics. It's still a living part of our history and a very important part of our history. As you know, you've written about the Rosenberg case, for instance. That's still, something that we all live with, and the seeds of what happened during the McCarthy era have sprouted in our current politics that have become really ugly and partisan and divisive.
So when you were writing the book, and obviously 18 years later when you see the film again, did it change your mind of whatever preconceptions you had before you started? Should we have dropped the bomb? Should we have done something different? Easy to second guess, of course.
Right. Well, Oppenheimer was motivated to build this weapon of mass destruction because he feared that the German physicists, whom he knew very well, were just as capable of building it as he was. And so it was a race. He didn't want Hitler to get it. And after the war, soon after the war, he realized from intelligence briefings how close the Japanese were to actually surrendering. So that raised some difficult questions about whether the bomb was actually necessary, whether it actually ended the war. And you know, the movie doesn't hammer you over the head with any thesis, but it plants questions. And you know, as I said, I think that's what we want to achieve as a biographer, and what Christopher Nolan, I think, wanted to achieve. He wanted people to question what happened and to dig into it and learn more about our history. So,
why is the atomic bomb, nuclear weaponry, the H-bomb, such a moral threshold? I mean, we had the firebombing of Dresden, of Tokyo. You know, we say we don't want to use cluster bombs.
right.
What difference does it make how we kill people?
Yeah, no, good question. And Oppenheimer, you know, 3 months after Hiroshima, gave a public speech in Philadelphia where he said some amazing things. He said, "You may think that this weapon was very expensive because we spent $2 billion to create it. It's actually very cheap. You may think that we have a monopoly on this. Actually, there are no secrets to its creation. The physics is known. It's simply an engineering problem. And it is a weapon for aggressors. It's not a defensive weapon. And it's a weapon of terror. And it's one bomb that can destroy a whole city. And if it's ever used again, you know, it could lead to Armageddon." So he was, right after the war, trying to warn us of the dangers and of the difficulty of living in the atomic age. So that's another reason why the film and the book are so relevant to our current times. You know, we're facing a war in the Ukraine, in the heart of Europe, and Vladimir Putin is threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons. And you know, what could that lead to? We can only imagine. So these are very tough questions that Oppenheimer himself, the father of the atomic bomb, was asking within months of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they're still very relevant today.
He said another war would be unthinkable because of the atomic bomb. Obviously, we've had wars, lots of people have been killed on all sides, but we haven't had a nuclear war. So was he right in a sense?
Well, he's been right so far. We've survived the nuclear age. We haven't used these weapons in anger, in combat. But the story's not over. And knowing human history and foibles of human nature, and knowing the potential for accidents, you know, it could still end badly. My co-author, the late Marty Sherwin, who spent 25 years on this book, his last book before he died in 2021 was called Gambling with Armageddon. And it's the best book ever written about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the theme of it was that we were just damn lucky to have survived. It was out of pure luck. We had no idea that the Russians had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba and were prepared to use them on the ground. And so it's again a stark warning that the story's not over and we have to not be complacent about these weapons.
And there are so many cases, some of which we're just learning about, that there were close calls when each side thought the other was about to use nuclear weapons. Turned out not necessarily to be true. In a story in the Times, I think by Dennis Overby, he interviewed Christopher Nolan, the director and writer, and pointed out in the production notes for the film, he said, "Like it or not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is the most important person who ever lived." Would you agree with that? He said that, isn't the most important person the person who pushes the button, but Nolan said you had to have the button, and Oppenheimer invented that.
Yes. Well, it's a very broad statement, and I have to say I was sort of taken aback when I first read it myself as the biographer. But, you know, you think about it, and yes, this is the physicist who gave us the atomic age. that we're still living with. And as such, he gave us the possibility of destroying our own world. And that's, by definition, a pretty important life to understand. And, I think Oppenheimer is important, but he's also endlessly fascinating and an enigma and a personality, he's sort of a scientific nerd, but also as a young man, he had a fascination and a love of French poetry and the novels of Ernest Hemingway. He was a polymath, and his life is just incredibly interesting and mysterious. And so I think that's reflected in the film that Nolan has produced this summer.
You've written recently a terrific biography of Jimmy Carter. You're working on a biography now of Roy Cohn. Why do we care about biography? Why do we care about other people's lives? You're head of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at CUNY Grad Center. Why should we care about how other people lived?
Well, human beings can't exist without telling stories to each other. This is how we understand our world. And biography just happens to be the most compelling vehicle for telling history. And it's also the most difficult. It takes a minimum of 5 to 10 years to produce a biography. And yet it's compelling as a vehicle because you're reading about one person's life, and you inevitably empathize with their struggle, and you keep turning the page. And along the way, you learn a lot of history and context. So it's an important art. And at the Leon Levy Center for Biography, that's our job, is to sort of promote and encourage the art and craft of biography and encourage biographers in their lonely pursuit of telling lives.
And your students who have come out of the center have produced many great biographies as well. So obviously you've succeeded. Kai Bird, the author of American Prometheus, the basis for the film Oppenheimer. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next, my conversation with New York Times cultural critic A.O. Scot. In October, I caught up with the New York Times' critic at large, A.O. Scot, after winding up more than 20 years critiquing film professionally and enduring a pandemic that dramatically changed the film-going experience for us all. He went back to the movies, this time for fun. For more than 2 decades, sitting down to watch a movie has been a part of A.O. Scot's job description, a duty. So when he left his post in March as film critic for the New York Times, he did anything but. This summer, he returned to the movie theaters, but as just another moviegoer, joining many others who were also getting back to an enjoyable pastime that had been put on hold. New York Times book review critic at large A.O. Scot writes about what makes a trip to the movies so important in this week's New York Times Magazine, as he asks himself, is it still worth going to the movies? Tony, so what's the answer? Is it?
The shocking answer is yes, it is. I wasn't necessarily surprised to discover that, but I felt like I was coming back to a part of myself, to a part of my own experience, to a part of the world that I'd in a way been missing out on for a long time. Not just because of the pandemic and the fact that people were going to the movies less. I was still going to the movies a lot, or going to screenings a lot, but I hadn't been to the movies just as kind of a regular person buying a ticket and going to the movies since the beginning of the century. So it was very new and very familiar to me in a way.
So Tony, was this the old normal or a new normal?
It felt like the old normal, which was one of the things that was exciting about it in a way. I was, I was not in New York. I was in a small vacation town on the New England coast where there were these old, Main Street movie theaters that have been refurbished into kind of nonprofit art centers that sometimes show first-run movies. And everyone had come out, all of the locals and a lot of the summer people had come out in late August to see Barbie and to see Oppenheimer, which was an old-fashioned phenomenon. And a movie comes out, two movies come out, and everyone wants to go see them, and everyone wants to talk about them, and everyone wants to bring their friends, and people want to go back and see them again. But that's something that we hadn't had for a very long time. And there was a conventional wisdom emerging even before the pandemic that said that that was over, that people weren't going to go to the movies that way anymore. People were going to go out a couple of times a year to go see a big blockbuster, to see a franchised movie like a Marvel movie or a Star Wars movie or maybe a Pixar movie. But otherwise, people are going to stay home and watch things on streaming. And the golden age of communal movie going was supposed to be over. And what we don't know is whether this was something of an anomaly or a throwback or a one shot, or whether something like the old habit of movie going, which had been very much in decline among audiences for a very long time, might be creeping back into the mainstream.
As Tony, you wrote in the Times, movie going has been pronounced dead many times before. Now it has been written off because streaming seems to be the next phase, the next new thing. Why does it seem to be different this time? Why has streaming not replaced it, or at least not yet?
Well, I mean, streaming has certainly eaten into it, and I think that the place that what they call theatrical distribution, what we call movie going, holds within the overall movie or motion picture economy is going to be smaller. I think that's true. That the convenience of streaming, the abundance of material that's available on streaming, the fact that you can watch it on any screen, and that people now have in their homes, rather nice screens that they're used to watching things on, without the distractions of other people, and with the possibility to pause the image if you need to use the bathroom, rather than trying to calculate the right time to sneak out of your row and walk past everyone. But I think that there are aspects of the experience of going to the movies that are not replaceable, and that people will continue and do continue to seek out as part of an overall menu of options. Because now we can watch almost anything we want, almost any place we want, at almost any time we want. So the choice to leave the house and go to the movies and sit in a dark room with a bunch of strangers is a different kind of choice.
You said that streaming has turned into a consumer habit that is a major cultural disaster. Why is that?
That was a little bit of hyperbole, but I do think that as with many things that come to us digitally, that seem, first of all, to be enormously convenient in ways that we had never imagined before. You don't have to call a cab and wait in the rain for a cab. You can go on Uber. You don't have to call someone on the phone. You can ping them on social media. And all of these solutions to problems that weren't maybe really problems. And I think that one of the things that happens with streaming is that it accelerates the conversion, the translation of everything, of all movies, of all television, into content, into sort of an undifferentiated just sea of content that we navigate with the help of an algorithm. So streaming makes us much more passive, much more isolated, much, I think, lazier as consumers of visual entertainment and art. There's something about going to the movies. Go to the movies, you make a choice, you make a commitment. You're going to go see Oppenheimer. You're going to sit there for 3 hours and watch Oppenheimer. If you're streaming the first 5 minutes of Oppenheimer, you're like, oh, I don't know. And you'll go watch an episode of a sitcom that you've watched 10 times before. Or you'll never find Oppenheimer because the algorithm in its intention to keep you watching all the time, will just keep feeding you stuff that it thinks that you want to watch. So the process of discovery, of critical thinking, of discernment, the sense of adventure that is an important part of movie going, of consuming any art form, is really diminished and blunted by streaming. And I think that we're only beginning to see what a real problem that has been, what a kind of a Trojan horse has been smuggled in with our subscriptions to all these wonderful platforms that have all of this wonderful content for us.
Not to denigrate your successors as movie critics, but you say the real measure of success and failure in the movies is money. Why is that when we read so much into criticism, into the blurbs of what critics say about movies?
Well, it's just it's a blunt fact that movies have always been, certainly in this country, a capitalist enterprise, and they cost an enormous amount of money to make and to distribute and to market, and they measure their success into how much they get back, and they've figured out the various companies, the movie studios, and the conglomerates that have succeeded them, and the streaming companies have tried to figure out how to get more of that money back. And in a way, it's important for, I'm certainly not diminishing the importance of critics who exist as an independent voice at an angle away from that emphasis on money. But it is true that movie criticism can feel like, and in some ways is, not only a species of art criticism, but a species of business journalism, of business reporting.
You say they never made movies like they used to. What do you mean?
I mean that there's always nostalgia, that someone will always say. I quote, the famous line from Norma Desmond in Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, where she says, the pictures got small, and she's a great silent movie goddess who's talking about the 1950s, which we now look at and we think, wow, 1950, early 1950s, late 40s and 50s were an incredible era in movies, but felt to many people at the time, critics, maybe not so much audiences, but people in Hollywood, critics, people who should have known and maybe should have known better, like a period of decline. And every period has been a period of decline. Every period that we now look back on as a great golden age, you can find someone writing an article saying it's terrible now, it's over. The movies are bad. They're not what they used to be. And of course, my point was just they were never what they used to be. Hindsight and nostalgia has this way of winnowing out all of the dross and just giving us the gold, and that's why it looks like a golden age.
Now that you can watch movies just for fun, which ones are you looking forward to?
Well, I have over one of the little perks of my long tenure as a film critic was that I got a lot of DVDs just sent to me, and I got a lot of wonderful Criterion Collection DVDs and Blu-rays of classic films, some of which I would like to rewatch, some of which I had never watched. So one of my great passions has always been Italian movies, and I have a whole lot of Rossellini and a whole lot of Fellini and a whole lot of Visconti and a whole lot of Italian horror movies and giallos from the 60s and 70s, and so I can program my own little Italian film festival and try to work on my Italian in the meantime.
You don't think you'll get tired of watching movies, will you?
Well, I certainly got tired of reviewing them. But no, I don't think I'll get tired of watching them. It is one of the great pleasures of modern life, but I am glad to spend my working hours reading books.
You're not going to get tired of reading books now, are you, as a critic at large for the book review?
That seems unlikely. There are an awful lot of books, and I can't often think of anything else to do with my time anyway. So it suits me well, this this new gig.
It'll be time well spent. One last thing, you say a number of movies fold in primal scenes of rapture that's beyond counting. And you mentioned Babylon, Emperor of Light, The Hand of God. What makes those so special?
Well, I think that those are recent movies which look back at the movie past and sort of imagine moments of magic. Babylon is about the silent era and that golden age of Hollywood. The Hand of God by the Italian director Paolo Sorrentino is about his own memories as a young kind of movie mad adolescent in the 1980s, which most people remember as anything but a golden age of movies. But there is a sort of a feeling in these movies, and in others, Cinema Paradiso is a great example that comes to mind, where there's just a kind of a rapture and enchantment and magic attached to the movies. And movies love that as a subject. Movies will never get tired of making movies about the magic of movies, about rediscovering it and in a way remythologizing their own power, their own charisma, their own glamour, as a way of keeping it going. And I think that they succeed. That movies like that, when they succeed, connect with something in the viewer that responds to the power of the images and just the feeling of being transported, of the way that a movie creates a whole other world, kind of both on the screen and in your mind at the same time.
Tony Scott, thanks for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.